Welcome back. This is Your Story Corner, a safe space designed and created specifically to help you relax and unwind, to remind you that you are not alone. No matter whatever is going on in your world right now, remember, it will pass, and you are going to be okay. We're glad to be back after a 2-week break with Your Story Corner, the podcast. If you are new here and this is the first time you've listened to our podcast, we're glad you have found us. Here I read bedtime stories available to help you relax, settle for a good night's sleep, or just help pass some time on your commute, or if you're making something to eat right now. Whatever your reason for listening to us, thank you for choosing Your Story Corner. You can listen to previous episodes on our website, Yourstorycorner.com, and follow us on all our social media channels, including TikTok, where we go live for some bedtime story reading from 10:30 p.m. UK time, live on TikTok. We apologize for the brief break from Story Corner, but yours truly, your host, otherwise known as Mr. S, had a virus that affected my vocal cords, which I'm pleased to say I'm fully recovered from. So, that solved that mystery. And talking of mystery and detecting things, it's my pleasure to start a brand new story. We're going to delve into the world of one of the most famous detectives, Sherlock Holmes. So, if you are new here, all I need you to do now is focus on the sound of my voice and check in with yourself. Breathe and relax. Before we start reading, and we will start at the very beginning, as ever, let's explore Sherlock Holmes with some little-known facts to get us in the mood. Sherlock Holmes is a name as famous as any from any famous works of literature, but he originally wasn't going to be called Sherlock Holmes. The name was changed to Sherlock, maybe because of a cricketer who bore the name Sherringford. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who created Holmes, was a fan of cricket, and the name Sherlock appears to have stuck in his memory. Doyle was also a keen cricketer himself, and between 1899 and 1907 he played 10 first-class matches for the Marylebone Cricket Club, quite fitting, since Baker Street is situated in that district of London. The first Sherlock Holmes novel was something of a flop. The detective made his debut in the novel A Study in Scarlet in 1887, written then by a 27-year-old Doyle in just 3 weeks. Famously, Doyle was inspired by a real-life lecture of his at the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Joseph Bell, who could diagnose patients simply by looking at them when they walked into his surgery. Another important influence on the creation of Sherlock was Edgar Allan Poe's fictional detective C. Augustine Dupin, two of which adventures you can find and listen to in some of Poe's best short story works. Doyle wrote the book while he was running a struggling doctor's surgery down in Portsmouth. The novel was rejected by many publishers and eventually published in Beeton's Christmas Annual, named after the husband of Mrs. Beeton of the Book of Cookery and Household Management fame. It didn't sell well and more or less sank without a trace. The second Sherlock Holmes novel was the result of a dinner party with Oscar Wilde. One person who admired the first novel was an editor, Joseph Stoddart, who edited Lippincott's monthly magazine. He convinced Doyle at a dinner party in 1889 to write a second novel featuring the detective. Oscar Wilde, who was also present, also agreed to write a novel for the magazine, his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which appeared in 1890, the same year as The Sign of Four, Doyle's novel. The famous image of Sherlock Holmes wearing a deerstalker hat is a product of the celebrated images which accompanied the short stories which appeared in the magazine from 1891. Beginning with the most famous, arguably, A Scandal in Bohemia. It is when the stories began to appear that Sherlock Holmes became a worldwide sensation. Sidney Paget, who drew the illustrations, had Holmes wearing a deerstalker when the detective went to the country to investigate mysteries at country houses and in small rural villages. But most people think of the detective as always donning the hat when off to investigate a case. Now, according to IMDb, Sherlock Holmes has appeared in 226 and more movies and films and been played by dozens of different actors since the advent of cinema in the late 19th century. It's hardly surprising that the sleuth's popularity inspired a raft of other writers to create rivals to Sherlock Holmes. But who is your favourite? Is it Henry Cavill? Or maybe Robert Downey Jr.? Or maybe, from the TV series, Benedict Cumberbatch? Sherlock Holmes is not the most film-famous character. That is, if you include non-humans, well, I guess, sort of humans. Dracula has been filmed more times than the Great Sleuth, at 239 times, but maybe more. But since Dracula is part man, part vampire, Sherlock Holmes is the most filmed fully human character. Maybe one day we'll read some Dracula. Sherlock Holmes didn't make deductions, at least not most of the time. Instead, and if we wanted to be technically accurate, he used the logical process known as abduction. The difference between them, reasoning, is that the latter is based more on inference from observation, where the conclusion drawn may not always necessarily be true. However, in deduction, the conclusion drawn from the available data is always necessarily true. But then again, since Holmes' reasoning always seemed to be correct, maybe it is deduction after all. If I said to you, what is one of the most famous quotes of Sherlock Holmes? Probably "Elementary, my dear Watson," will come first to mind. However, Holmes never said it. Not in the canon of the original Conan Doyle novels and stories. Holmes says "elementary" and "my dear Watson" at various points, but the idea of putting them together was a later occurrence, which most possibly arose because it neatly conveys Holmes' effortless superiority to his dear friend and foil. The first recorded use of this exact phrase is actually in a P.G. Wodehouse novel of 1915. The Sherlock Holmes Museum both is and isn't at 221B Baker Street. Although the museum in London bears the official address, 221B, In line with the celebrated addresses from the stories, the museum's building lies between 237 and 241 Baker Street, making it physically, if not officially, at number 239. And there's more to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle than Sherlock Holmes. Much more, in fact. Among other achievements, his legal campaigning led to the establishment of the Court of Criminal Appeal. He was knighted for his journalistic work during the Second Boer War, not for his achievements in fiction, law, or medicine. We owe the word Grimpin to him, from Grimpin Meyer and the Hound of the Baskervilles. He wrote historical novels, such as The White Company and Sir Nigel, set during the 14th century, which he prized more highly than his detective fiction. Winston Churchill agreed, and was a devoted fan of his historical novels. Doyle also wrote science fiction romances such as The Lost World, which would go on from 1912 to inspire Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park novels, and subsequently Steven Spielberg's film. The sequel to the novel and film being named in a homage to Doyle, The Lost World. Doyle also took up legal causes himself. Read Julian Barnes's novel, Arthur and George, for his most famous real-life case. There's many more famous facts about the author and his famous detective, and we'll explore them more in future episodes of Your Story Corner. But hopefully that's whet your appetite for your bedtime story, as we turn now right where it began. In a study in Scarlet. This is Your Story Corner, the podcast. Time now for your story. Settle down, relax, and if you can, close your eyes. Focus on the sound of my voice, and paint the pictures in your mind. Bring them to life as we read A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 1. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. From the reminiscence of John H. Watson, M.D., late of the Army Medical Department. In the year 1878, I took my degree of Doctor of Medicine of the University of London, and proceeded neatly to go through the course prescribed for surgeons in the army. Having completed my studies there, I was duly attached to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers as an assistant surgeon. The regiment was stationed in India at the time, and before I could join it, the Second Afghan War had broken out. On landing at Bombay, I learned that my corps had advanced through the passes, and was already deep in the enemy's country. I followed, however, with many other officers who were in the same situation as myself, and succeeded in reaching the destination in safety, where I found my regiment, and at once entered upon my new duties. The campaign brought honours and promotion to many, but for me it had nothing but misfortune and disaster. I was removed from my brigade, and attached to the Berkshires, with whom I served at the fatal battle. There I was struck on the shoulder by a bullet which shattered the bone and grazed the artery. I should have fallen into the hands of the murderous enemy, but had not been for the devotion and courage shown by Murray, my orderly, who threw me across a pack horse and succeeded in bringing me safely to the British lines. Worn with pain and weak from the prolonged hardships which I had undergone, I was removed with a great train of wounded sufferers to the base hospital, Peshawar. Here I rallied, and had already improved so far as to be able to walk about the wards, and even to bask upon a little upon the veranda, when I was struck down by an enteric fever, that curse of our Indian possessions. For months my life was despaired of, and when at last I came to myself, became convalescent, I was so weak that a medical board determined that not a day should be lost in sending me back to England. I was dispatched accordingly in the troop ship, and landed a month later at Portsmouth, with my health ruined, but with permission from the government to spend the next 9 months in attempting to improve it. I had neither kith nor kin in England, and was therefore as free as air, or as free as an income of 11 shillings and 6pence a day will permit a man to be. Under such circumstances I naturally gravitated to London, a great cesspool into which all the loungers and idlers of the empire are irresistibly drained. There I stayed for some time at a private hotel in the Strand, leading comfortless, meaningless existence, and spending such money as I had considerably more freely than I ought. So alarming did the state of my finances become that I soon realized I must either leave the city and procrastinate somewhere in the country, or that I must make a complete alteration in my style of living. Choosing the latter alternative, I began by making up my mind to leave the hotel, and take up my quarters in some less pretentious and less expensive domicile. On the very day that I had come to this conclusion, I was standing at the Criterion bar when someone tapped me on the shoulder. Turning around, I recognized young Stamford, being a dresser under me at Bart's. The sight of a friendly face in the great wilderness of London is a pleasant thing indeed to a lonely man. In old days Stamford had never been a particular crony of mine, but now I hailed him with enthusiasm, and he, in turn, appeared to be delighted to see me. In the exuberance of my joy, I asked him to lunch with me at the Holborn. We started off together in a hansom. "What have you been doing with yourself, Watson?" he asked in an undisguised wonder, as we rattled through the crowded London streets. "You're as thin as a lath and as brown as a nut." I gave him a short sketch of my adventures, and had hardly concluded it by the time that we had reached our destination. "Poor devil," he said, commiseratingly, after he had listened to my misfortunes. "What are you up to now?" "I'm looking for lodgings," I answered, trying to solve the problem as to whether it is possible to get comfortable rooms at a reasonable price. "Well, that's a strange thing," remarked my companion. "You are the second man today that has used that expression to me." "And who was the first?" I asked. "It was a fellow who was working at the chemical laboratory up at the hospital. He was bemoaning himself this morning because he could not get someone to go halves with him in some nice rooms which he had found, and which were too much for his purse." "By Jove," I cried, "if he really wants someone to share the rooms and the expense, I am the very man for him. I prefer having a partner to being alone." Young Stamford looked rather strangely at me over his wine-glass. "You don't know Sherlock Holmes yet," he said. "Perhaps you would not care for him as a constant companion." "Why, what is there against him?" "Oh, I didn't say there was anything against him. He is still strange in his ideas and enthusiast in some branches of science. As far as I know, he's a decent fellow enough." "Medical student, I suppose," said I. "No, I have no idea what he intends to go in for. I believe he's well up in anatomy, and he is a first-class chemist, but as far as I know, he has never taken out any systematic medical classes. His studies are very desultory and eccentric, but he has amassed a lot of out-of-the-way knowledge which should astonish his professors." "Did you ever ask him what he was going in for?" I asked. "No, he is not a man that is not easy to draw out, although he can be communicative enough when the fancy sees him." "Well, I would like to meet him," I said. "If I am to lodge with anyone, I prefer a man of studious and quiet habits. I am not strong enough yet to stand much noise or excitement, and enough of both in Afghanistan to last me for the remainder of my natural existence. How could I meet this friend of yours?" "Well, he's sure to be at the laboratory," returned my companion. He either avoids the place for weeks, or else he works there from morning till night. If you like, we can drive round together after lunch." "Certainly," I answered, and the conversation drifted away into other channels.
Do you ever wish you could sit in on a conversation with some of your favorite authors and listen to them talk about their writing process, their path to publication, and of course, their newest novels? Hi, I'm Marissa Meyer, best-selling author of The Lunar Chronicles, and I would love for you to check out the Happy Writer podcast, where every week I talk with other writers about books, craft, inspiration, and how to bring a little more joy into our lives. The Happy Writer is available wherever you get your podcasts, or find us on Instagram at Happy Writer Podcast.
As we made our way to the hospital after leaving the Holborn, Stamford gave me a few more particulars about this gentleman whom I proposed to take as a fellow lodger. "You mustn't blame me if you don't get on with him," he said. "I know nothing more of him than I have learned from meeting him occasionally in the laboratory. You proposed this arrangement, so you must not hold me responsible." "Well, if we don't get on, it'll be easy to part company," I answered. "Seems to me, Stamford," I added, looking hard at the companion, "do you have some reason for washing your hands of this matter? Is this fellow's temper so formidable? What is it? Don't be mealy-mouthed about it." "Well, it's not easy to express the inexpressible," he answered with a laugh. "Holmes is a little too scientific for my tastes. It approaches to cold bloodiness. I can imagine him giving a friend a little pinch of the latest vegetable alkaloid, not out of malevolence, you understand, but simply out of spirit of inquiry, in order to have an accurate idea of the effects. To do him justice, I think that he would take it himself with the same readiness. He appears to have a passion for the definite and exact knowledge. Well, very right, too. Yes, but it may be pushed to excess. When it comes to beating the subjects in dissecting rooms with a stick, it's certainly taking rather a bizarre shape." "Beating the subjects?" "Yes, to verify how far bruises may be produced after death. I saw a matter with my own eyes." "And you yet say he is not a medical student?" "No. Heaven knows what the objects of his studies are. But here we are, and you must form your own impressions about him." As we spoke, we turned down a narrow lane and passed through a small side door, which opened into a wing of the great hospital. It was a familiar ground to me, and I needed no guiding as we ascended the bleak stone staircase and made our way down the long corridor with its vista of whitewashed wall and dun-coloured doors. Near the farther end of a low arched passage branched away from it and led into the chemical laboratory. This was a lofty chamber, lined and littered with countless bottles. Broad, low tables were scattered about, which bristled with retorts, test tubes, and little Bunsen lamps with their blue, flickering flames. There was only one student in the room, who was bending over a distant table absorbed in his work. At the sound of our steps, he glanced around and sprang to his feet with a cry of pleasure. "I've found it! I've found it!" he shouted to my companion, running towards us with a test tube in his hand. "I have found a reagent which is precipitated by hemoglobin, and by nothing else." Had he discovered a gold mine, greater delight could not have shone upon his features. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said Stamford, introducing us. "How are you?" he said cordially, gripping my hand with a strength for which I would hardly have given him credit. "You've been in Afghanistan, I perceive." "How on earth did you know that?" I asked in astonishment. "Never mind," said he, chuckling to himself. "The question now is about the hemoglobin. No doubt you see the significance of the discovery of mine." Well, it's interesting chemically, no doubt, I answered. But practically, why, man, this is the most practical medical legal discovery for years. Don't you see that it gives us infallible tests for bloodstains? Now, come over here now. He seized me by the coat sleeve in his eagerness and drew me over to the table at which he had been working. Let us have some fresh blood, he said, digging a long bodkin into his finger and drawing off the resulting drop of blood in a chemical pipette. Now, I shall add this small quantity of blood to the litre of water. You perceive that the resulting mixture has the appearance of blue water. The proportion of blood cannot be more than 1 in a million. I have no doubt, however, that we shall be able to obtain a characteristic reaction. As he spoke, he threw into the vessel a few white crystals, and then added some drops of a transparent fluid. In an instant the contents assumed a dull mahogany colour, and a brownish dust was added to the bottom of the glass jar. "Ha, ha!" he cried, clapping his hands, and looking as delighted as a child with a new toy. "Well, what do you think of that?" "Well, it seems to be a very delicate test," I remarked. "Beautiful, beautiful." Our test was very clumsy and uncertain, so the microscopic examination of blood corpuscles, the latter is valueless if the stains are a few hours old. Now, this appears to act as well whether the blood is old or new. Had this test been invented, there are hundreds of men now walking the earth who would long ago have paid the penalty of their crimes. "Indeed," I murmured. "Criminal cases are continually hinging upon that one point. A man is suspected of a crime months, perhaps after it has been committed. His linen or clothes are examined, and brownish stains discovered upon them. Are they blood stains, or mud stains, or rust stains, or fruit stains, or what are they? That is a question which has puzzled many an expert. And why? Because there is no reliable test. Now we have the Sherlock Holmes test, and there will be no longer any difficulty." His eyes fairly glittered as he spoke, and he put his hand over his heart and bowed as if to make some imploring crowd conjure up by his imagination. "You are to be congratulated," I remarked, considerably surprised at his enthusiasm. "You see, there was this case of von Birchoff at Frankfurt last year. He would have certainly been hung had this test been in existence. Then there was the Mason of Bradford, and the notorious Muller, and the Lefevre of Montpellier, and the Samson of New Orleans. I could name a score of cases in which it could have been decisive." "He seemed to be a walking calendar of crimes," said Stamford with a laugh. "He might start a paper on those lines. Call it the police news of the past." "Very interesting reading it might make, too," remarked Sherlock Holmes, sticking a small piece of plaster over the prick of his finger. "I have to be careful," he continued, turning to me with a smile, "for I dabble with poisons a good deal." He held out his hand as he spoke, and I noticed that it was all mottled over with similar pieces of plaster and discoloured with strong acids. Yes, well, we came here on business," said Stamford, sitting down on a high three-legged stool and pushing another one in my direction with his foot. "My friend here wants to make diggings, and as you were complaining that you could get no one to halves with you, I thought that I'd better bring you together." Sherlock Holmes seemed delighted at the idea of sharing his rooms with me. "I have my eye on a suite in Baker Street," he said, "which would suit us down to the ground. You don't mind the smell of strong tobacco, I hope?" "Well, I always smoke ships myself," I answered. "Well, that's good enough. I generally have chemicals about and occasionally do experiments. Would that annoy you?" "Well, by no means. Let me see, what are my other shortcomings? Yes, I get in the dumps at times. I don't open my mouth for days on end. You must not think I'm sulky when I do that. Just let me alone, and I'll soon be all right. What have you to confess now? It's just as well for two fellows to know the worst of one another before they begin to live together." I laughed at this cross-examination. Well, I keep a bold pup, and I object to rows because my nerves are shaken, and I get up at all sorts of ungodly hours, and I'm extremely lazy. Another set of vices when I'm well, but those are the principal ones at present. Do you include violin playing in your category of rows? He asked anxiously. Well, it depends on the player, I answered. A well-played violin is a treat for the gods. A badly played one... Well, that's all right, he cried, with a merry laugh. I think we may consider the thing as settled. That is, if the rooms are agreeable to you. Well, when shall we see them? Call for me here at noon tomorrow, and we'll go together and settle everything, he answered. All right, noon exactly, said I, shaking his hand. We left him working among his chemicals, and we walked together towards my hotel. By the way, I asked suddenly, stopping and turning upon Stamford, how the deuce did he know that I'd come from Afghanistan? My companion smiled, an enigmatical smile. That's just his little peculiarity, he said. A good many people have wanted to know how he finds things out. Oh, a mystery, is it? I cried, rubbing my hands. This is very interesting. I'm very much obliged to you for bringing us together. The proper study of mankind is man, you know. Well, you must study him, then, Stamford said, as he bade me goodbye. You'll find him a knotty problem, though. I'll wager he learns more about you than you about him. Goodbye. Goodbye, I answered, and I strolled on to my hotel, considerably interested in my new acquaintance. And so ends Chapter 1 of A Study in Scarlet by Arthur Conan Doyle. Well, I hope you enjoyed that first episode and dive into the world of Sherlock Holmes. We will continue alternating chapters of A Study in Scarlet and some Winnie the Pooh for those who've been reaching out wanting to hear the next chapters. You can now interact with us also at the end of each episode of this podcast. If you are listening to us on Spotify, you can leave your comments and feedback of stories that you would like to hear and what you enjoyed most of this week's episode. You can also reach out to us on one of our many social media channels. You can reach us on Instagram, where my team are always happy to hear from you. Just go to our website, Yourstorycorner.com. And thank you once again for bearing with us while I had a couple of weeks off to get back to normal, whatever that means. But now it's time for you to rest and sleep. So thank you for listening to our podcast. We continue to be overwhelmed by the thousands of people that are listening to our podcast around the world, designed and created to help you relax, listen to some stories, and I hope settle you for a good night's sleep. So, until next time, remember, you are not alone. And we'll see you again soon. Bye for now. Good night.